got a question for you. How does a regime focused on perpetuating and expanding its own power, such as the one currently occupying Washington, D.C., crush all opposition, both actual and potential? Well, before I give you my answer, jump down into the comments section and tell me what you think. Well, according to Michael Anton in his new commentary for American Greatness, the regime I described conducts what in national security parlance is a PSY-OP, our psychological operation. This is what seems to be going on right now in our country. According to Anton, this form of propagandizing is done to demoralizing. That sure seems to be happening. And also to create other opportunities that otherwise might not present themselves. For example, to create the opportunity to stop dissent, they first have to criminalize it. And since we supposedly live in a free country, criminalizing dissent poses a bit of a problem. This is America. So unless you're young and brainwashed, we naturally resist attempts to restrict our free speech and persecute us for our politics. So the regime needs a big-time excuse in order to make that happen. So what do Americans hate and fear at least as much as incursions on their freedom? Terrorism, mob rule, civil strife, and civil war. There we are. Americans hate the thought of civil war. In order to rein in political opposition and stifle dissent, an effective plan might be to make Americans extremely concerned about domestic terrorism and ultimately civil war. And since our rulers are leftist, they have to make the perceived threat come from the right. The main tool that the government has for implementing such a propaganda plan is fact-based lies. It is a fact that some conservatives truly believe we're headed down the road to civil war simply because the country is so divided, as they say in divorce court, irreparably broken. Now, if we're talking about a violent rebellion, an insurrection, that's a war that very likely could not be won. Perhaps an amicable divorce as a last resort could be workable if it came to that, rather than to give up our freedom, but not civil war. It's also a fact that a relative handful of people from the right really were involved in the January 6th riot in a way that went beyond walking into the rotunda and just taking some selfies. But the threat they posed has been so greatly exaggerated by Congress and the media that many Democrats actually believe that a small, unarmed group posed a serious threat to our democracy and that they were seriously trying to take over the government. Of course, that's ludicrous. But I think we're starting to see that there is nothing so ludicrous that people won't believe if it's drummed into them by their political masters. Even though there's no domestic terrorism going on, at least not on the right, the federal government has set up a domestic terrorism unit, and their purpose, go in search of domestic terrorism. They're targeting those who are motivated by racial animus, as well as those who ascribe to extremist anti-government and anti-authority ideologies. So who are these people? So-called anti-vaxxers? The unmasked? Parents opposed to critical race theory? Those who sign petitions for election audits? Conservative bloggers? Viewers of this video, maybe? Yeah, you might be one of them too. Well, importantly, since there are no acts of domestic terrorism being perpetuated by the right, the government is targeting motives, feelings, ideologies. In other words, what people think, and not just what they do. We're even seeing examples in the media of commentaries that defend the use of this PSY-OP strategy, all in the name of fighting disinformation. Of course, the problem with this kind of content control is that disinformation or misinformation is anything the government authority says that it is. Lately, the buzz being generated is that because of angry Americans on the right, our country is being primed for civil war. In order to maintain this narrative, the left uses the closest thing it has to that, January 6th. It would seem the regime is trying to brainwash everyone to believe that January 6th was the equivalent of 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. But it just isn't working. 3/4 of Americans think it was a protest that went too far. So the regime needs Plan B. Plan B is to create that buzz, to talk up domestic strife and impending civil war. Even books are coming out about this so that Americans increasingly believe the threat and they become frightened. Of course, if they're frightened enough, they'll start to accept more draconian measures that would normally be unthinkable. And I would add that the virus is a great example of this. Those who cower in fear of COVID will accept any amount of restrictions, lockdowns, vaccine passports, employer mandates, an endless string of booster shots, social isolation, tracking, travel restrictions, censorship, detention, even denial of medical care for the unvaccinated. It's just a matter of generating enough fear and dread. The same can be done to instill fear in political opponents. In fact, there is even some overlap as resistance to COVID mandates is being politicized. So if you've been hearing more about the threat or even the inevitability of civil war lately, it's not your imagination. And Michael Anton warns that the feds behind this plan want you to step out of line. They want you to do something that they can paint as a prelude to starting a war, because that gives them all the excuse they need to respond with more censorship, surveillance, no-knock raids, computer and record seizures, asset confiscation, frivolous but deadly serious criminal charges, endless pretrial detention, and draconian sentences for misdemeanors and even non-crimes. So don't play into it. That doesn't mean you have to be complacent or utterly compliant. Just be smart about how you protest our overreaching government. I would recommend thinking of this as a chess game. Our next move has to be checkmate at the ballot box. Well, if you want to stay informed on the news, be sure to click the subscribe button below and the notification bell next to it. And if you enjoyed this video, why don't you consider leaving a like and sharing it as well? And what do you think about all this talk about impending civil war? Do you think it could be part of a PSY-OP? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And by the way, don't miss an opportunity to be with us Friday for a live stream. I'll catch up on the news of the week and answer your questions live when we have a chance to be together. Finally, don't ever forget, you can get my twice-a-day take on the news by signing up for my newsletter by going to MikeHuckabee.com. It is completely free, by the way, advertiser supported. That's going to do it for this edition of The Breakdown. I'm Mike Huckabee.